specifically related to how we responded to communities that were impacted by family violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and so on. So as part of that, the National Latina Network for Healthy Families and Communities, Project of Casa Esperanza, was born. Back in 2011, Casa Esperanza received their first TA, or Training and Technical Assistance grant, from Office of Violence Against Women. And again, the NLN, or the National Latina Network, is identified as one of the culturally specific resource centers on family violence and sexual assault under FIPSA, the division of HHS. As part of that, we do several forms of training and technical assistance, and falls under three core areas: public policy, research, and of course, training and technical assistance. Language access is just one of the components that falls under our training and technical assistance services. We have different projects primarily funded under OVW and Health and Human Services, or HHS. And I also welcome you to visit our website, thenationallatinanetwork.org, to get more familiar with our services, what type of training and technical assistance we may be able to provide your organization, and so on. And I myself, I have the role of a project manager at the national project of the National Latina Network, Casa Esperanza. Been doing this work for 20 years now. I am a native Texan, originally from Brownsville, Texas, and I am located in Austin. And most of the members of the national network were spread all over the country. So we have 3 folks here in Texas, including myself. We have team member in Puerto Rico, Boston, California, Idaho, Atlanta, Reno, and of course, St. Paul, Minnesota, which is our home base. And just like with anything, whether it's virtual training or in-person training, we always like to start off with some guiding principles to the dialogue we're about to have with anyone who is participating in our presentations. Because anytime we talk about the intersections around identity as it intersects with gender-based violence, in this case, sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, and so on, a lot of things come up for folks. And certainly talking about the intersections of language as being part of cultural identity, and starting out this conversation, how do we create our organizations to be more accessible for survivors with limited English proficiency, is part of that conversation. So just to remind folks, just be mindful of your thoughts, how you're reacting to the dialogue, reflect on your own privilege and biases as we have this next this next hour and a half together. Try to create and maintain a safe space, learning space in this dialogue. I will try to be as interactive in the webinar, so there will be some parts in the webinar that will ask for your interaction, so which will be, I will ask you to just put your answers or responses in the chat box. Be self-aware, share the space, honor diversity, and be present. I know that sometimes the challenge with webinars is it's practical, and sometimes we might get distracted by work or so on, which I totally appreciate. But try to be as present as much as you can. And when you find yourself tuning out from the dialogue, really ask yourself why. Because again, a lot of times when we talk about the intersectional approach of ending gender sexual assault or sexual violence, and a lot of people may react to certain things, is because are we being triggered by the dialogue, or being reactive because a certain type of privilege we're talking about, we're dismantling, is a privilege that I have. So again, just to be mindful of those guiding principles around this dialogue. So this is one of those pieces around interaction. So just very quickly, just want to get a sense of folks, and if you can please put your answer in the chat box. Does your organization, agency have bicultural, bilingual staff? If folks can just put yes or no, that'd be great. And then the next question, have you ever tried to learn a different language? Yes or no. And then Is the language you speak tied to your identity? Again, yes or no answers would be awesome. Some folks have said they've tried to learn Spanish. Has anyone tried to learn another language other than Spanish? ASL, yes. So thank you for reminding me about that. So when we talk about language, we also have to be mindful of diverse forms of communication for community members. So just I'm going to try to be mindful of not just thinking about spoken language, but also diverse forms of communication. And what does that look like? Because for those folks who may not be aware, ASL is actually a different form of communication, and it has its own rules around sign language and so on. We won't focus too much on that, but definitely thank you for some folks for reminding me of that. It seems like also some folks are saying that yes, language is definitely tied to identity, and like I said, we'll talk more about that as we go along. So thank you all for sharing your responses. So before we get into the whole crux of language being part of identity and what does it look like and what does it feel like, really want to talk very briefly around examining culture and what is it and how it impacts our work. Because I think don't want to assume either. It's like, what is our understanding about culture? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How do people interpret that? And again, we define culture in many different ways. Certainly, we have some very mainstream definitions about culture, but I just want to touch a little bit on this for a minute. So again, this is one of those pieces around interaction. So what is culture? Folks could just briefly write in the chat box, what is culture? Folks can just define that for very quickly. Just what is culture to you all? What does it mean? Don't be shy now. There's no right or wrong answer. So what is culture? How do you define? So people are saying a way of life. It could mean your background, mixture of traditions and religious practices. Yes, all of that. Worldview, food. Yes, food is very important. Language, of course. Heritage. Okay, thank you. How about this other question is, why do we need to know about culture? Someone mentioned tribal heritage. Thank you. Why do we need to know about culture? If people can just quickly in the chat box put your responses. Why do we need to know about culture? And this broader sense of that. Make sure we don't offend others. Okay, yeah. Understand people better. Impacts our interactions with others. Who we are. Okay, so mostly folks are saying trying to communicate with each other, how to relate with each other, and so on. Thank you. Understanding history, yes, that's definitely very important as part of that conversation. And then the last question I want to ask you all, and please put your responses in the chat box, is why does culture matter? Why does culture matter? People matter, identity, being respectful and compassionate of people. It's what, it impacts everyone, relates to trauma. Yes. Yes. Feel connected, empathy, all these things. So folks are using a lot of descriptors around emotion, connection, communication, and yes, and understanding other people's ways of life, unifying for sure. Yeah, definitely. So thank you for that. And again, just to get a sense of really defining what culture is and means for us. And again, it can be very different for different folks. So diving deeper into the question around culture, and some of you may have seen the Cultural Iceberg before. This is just a diagram to kind of put things into a visual perspective of how culture may be defined in very different ways. But sometimes when we talk about culture, we really just get stuck in on the surface of the conversation. A lot of folks will respond to like food, clothing, music, sports, things you see and understand clearly, right? But then if we start diving deeper into the dialogue, we start to think about body language, literature, arts, behavior. So these are things you can see and you can understand if you try, right? And certainly around language, when in this case we're talking about language and language being part of cultural identity, people speak different forms of language or communicate diversely or differently from us, right? And so when we lack that understanding of being able to communicate through language, it might cause some misunderstandings. And even when we're translating or interpreting from one language to another can have many different ways. So, for example, when we're talking about Spanish, certainly folks from the Latino communities speak Spanish, but depending on the regionalism or use of a certain adjective or verb or noun may be different in different Spanish-speaking communities, right? And so that may be a source of miscommunication. And certainly putting it in the context of advocacy, I've seen that happen in the case of court situations where you may have a court interpreter and they may speak Spanish, but a person may use a certain word or noun or adjective to describe a whole different thing, which really could cause a misinterpretation and may cause a conflict of the entire context of the conversation. When we dive even deeper into the issue around culture, we start talking about religion, family, beliefs, attitudes, and knowledge, which I think these are the most fundamental things that we all may grow up with and we believe to be right or wrong. So these things which take time to see and understand. And certainly, again, going back to language, understanding each other through the ability to communicate through language or diverse forms of communication. And again, the way you communicate that, if you have the ability to understand and communicate in a way that makes sense to each other. And again, in the work of advocacy that we do, that is so important. Communication is a fundamental piece of our advocacy work. Active listening, right? And then when you're not able to understand or be able to communicate with people, that could misinterpret so many things, right? And so at the basis of everything, active listening is a form of communication. And if we are not able to understand how people are communicating in diverse ways or communicating spoken language or using some form of communication, can cause them a lot of conflict or misunderstanding. And again, if we delve even deeper into the conversation about culture, we start acknowledging issues around history and historical trauma. Some of you mentioned it's like why culture matters. It's like some of you mentioned history and trauma, and understanding that in some communities, the basis of being unable to access certain services because of how people identify and how people speak or communicate, it may be a form of reoccurring trauma, historical trauma. So again, just to put a visual on when we start talking about culture and start delving deeper into these conversations. And again, the deeper we go into the conversations, the more uncomfortable it becomes for us. And really some of that uncomfortable feelings come from our sense of our privileges that we may have and being able to dismantle that and having critical analysis around that. So for example, the privilege that I have of being able to speak English and to be able to communicate in a community that is predominantly English speaking, it is a privilege, right? I also have the privilege of being bilingual in Spanish, right? And what does that carry and what does that mean for me as an advocate, as a person who engages folks in diverse conversations and dialogues around the intersections of sexual violence, cultural identity, and so on. So just putting that into some form of frame or perspective for us. So the other question that comes to us is, do I have culture, right? So just very quickly, again, this is another moment of engagement. It's like, do you have culture? Do you all think you have culture? Yes or no? Yes, I do. Yes. Um, so folks are responding yes. But what does that mean, right? What does that mean specifically to the individual, to yourself, when we ask this question, do I have culture? And again, part of that is the language that we speak or the diverse forms of ways we use to communicate with others in our communities, in our circles of social media, relationships, professional relationships, what have you, right? So yes, we all have culture, whatever that means to you. It depends on what is fundamental to you, what your perceptions of right and wrong, morality, and so on, right? So yes, we all have culture. So what's your culture, right? So so when we start talking about these intersections, in this case around language as being part of cultural identity, it's like, how do you identify? Because that's so important, right? What is your role and what is your predominant role and how do you predominantly identify? In this case of language, are you bilingual Spanish speaker? Are you bilingual other? Or do you use diverse forms of communication such as ASL? Like, how do you identify? How does your culture shape you, right? Because it does, right? Some of us have the fortune of growing in families that are broad, and the definition of family may be broad and dynamic. For us, the definition of family is a lot more prescriptive and more defined. But of course, how does your culture shape you? And it does. And even when you bring in the dialogue around language, it definitely does shape you. For example, because I am able to speak Spanish, I am able to communicate with my elders who don't speak English. I am able to communicate with my parents who may be predominantly Spanish speakers, right? And it could also be a form of being ostracized, because certainly we have certain perceptions that come to mind when we hear someone speak with an accent, whatever that accent may be. How does culture shape the way you see yourself, others, and the world? Again, when we bring it to the context of language and diverse forms of communication, it does. It definitely does. The example I gave around people speaking with accents, it automatically, there may be this assumption that this person may not be highly educated. They may not be able to understand what I'm trying to communicate. A lot of things come for folks around accents, or people who speak with an accent, or maybe limited English proficient, or maybe not be able to speak or use this a diverse way of communicating with others. So again, just to put into a frame of reference, like, how do you identify? How does your culture shape you? How does culture shape the way you see yourself and others in the world? In this case, we're talking about language and diverse forms of communication. And again, to emphasize, it's about having these crucial understandings, becoming more self-aware of how culture help us to appreciate and know ourselves more deeply. Because the one thing I do want to emphasize is, and I say this quite often in the presentations I do, is that a lot of times when we go to presentations, conferences, or trainings, they teach us about how diverse communities need to access us, when in fact it should be the other way around. It's really about us, who are gatekeepers to the services that we provide. How are we accessible to diverse communities? Because it is up to us. We are the gatekeepers. So again, in talking about and having this dialogue with you, particularly around language, culture, and identity, and what does that look like for survivors and communities of survivors of diverse communities, it's about us. And we're also reminding ourselves that we also come from diverse communities. And we may also be identifying with those diverse communities we're trying to engage in this case around language access. So just being mindful of that. The work requires community and each of us supporting each other. Again, it's a reciprocal relationship. It is not I know more, I know less. It is about community, and the community at the core of these conversations and these dialogues. Understanding the roots will change behaviors more than apply rules or behaviors will. Again, also having an understanding that we live in a very global community or global society now, where we're seeing more and more diverse forms of communication being used, and also language spoken in our communities, and being acknowledging of that. And even when you don't see it, again, it's there, right? And so just having these kind of critical analyses of ourselves as the gatekeepers, and how we're reacting to the other, or survivors of diverse communities who may be limited in English proficient or use diverse forms of communication. Which brings us to this conversation around cultural competency, cultural responsiveness, and of course the ultimate goal, in my very humble opinion, is cultural humility, right? So very quickly, cultural competence really is the baseline of the work that we do. To me, cultural competence at the baseline teaches us about how different we are from each other, right? And so this helps us in implementing, and having some form of communication or some form of empathy. It helps us in development of policies and protocols through our systems, our organizations, and as professionals. And also gives us some sense of how to work cross-culturally or cross-communities as well. But again, cultural competence really just at the baseline of this conversation teaches us how different we are from each other. It doesn't go beyond that. When we start engaging in dialogues around cultural responsiveness, we really start to have a dialogue around not just understanding how we're different from each other, but what those differences are, and asking why. Why? So willingness to accept many ways of viewing the world, respect for difference, which some of you mentioned a lot already in the chat box, respecting others and people's worldviews and so on. And also it implicates that we're willing to learn. We're willing to be the student. We're willing to be to have some form of empathy and some form of knowledge around the diverse communities we're trying to engage. And again, we're talking about communities with limited English proficiency or may use diverse forms of communication. And I initiate that, right? Now, when we go into cultural humility or being culturally humble, it really it's a more of a critical analysis based on the privileges that I may have, which causes me to have some preconceived notions of the other, right? And so we've gone from cultural competency, which understanding we're different from each other. Cultural responsiveness is a willingness to understand why we're different from each other. And cultural humility, or being cultural humble about approaching each other, is really acknowledging that I have certain levels of privileges that others don't, and how do I use that in the benefit of my community and other communities, right? And also understanding that I am not the center of the universe, right? And what I thought to be right may not be right at all, or may be different for others, right? In the case around language and having the privilege to be part of the dominant English-speaking community, that is a privilege that I have. And so how do I use it to build communication and appreciation, acknowledgement of diverse communities who may not be part of the dominant English-speaking community, or may use diverse forms of communication? And this cultural humility is a lifelong process. It is a lifelong process that is imperfect, and that requires a lot of internal analysis of myself, and this dismantling, and being willing to be part of the dismantling of whatever privilege I may possess, right? Whether it's male privilege, whether it's being able-bodied privilege, being English-speaking privilege, so on. So really, at that base, that's what this is all about. And ultimately, this is again, a lifetime process of having this cultural humility or being culturally humble, right? So moving on, and then talking about, so again, I just wanted to address that before we got into this, because I think having understanding of how we define culture for each other and having what is being culturally competent, being culturally responsive, and then being culturally humble is part of this dialogue and ongoing dialogue. So now we're going to jump into examining language as an identity. Again, what is it and how it impacts our work? So just a very quick question. Again, please put your responses, like how many languages are spoken in the U.S.? Can y'all just guess? And you can put your response in the chat box. How many languages do you think are spoken in the U.S. right now? Hundreds? Okay. 6, I have no idea. 113. Over 2,000, 55. Okay, so people are being astronomical or or cautious. Based on just what's been reported, according to the 2011 Census Bureau, there's about 381 different languages spoken in the U.S. Again, this is just spoken languages. We're not even accounting for folks who may use diverse forms of communication, i.e. ASL, right? And this is back in 2011. And again, I'm just going to go over some statistics just to put some context to the conversation. Again, 381, again, back in 2011. Some more statistics. 1 out of 5 people living in the U.S. can speak a language other than English in the home. It seems like the predominant spoken 7 languages is Spanish, Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, French, Korean, and German. Each have over 1 million speakers in the U.S. And this is according to an infographic from redlines.com. They're a interpreter provider service. They're a national organization. So again, just 7 languages spoken. Again, these are some of the more predominantly spoken languages spoken in the U.S. Of course, that's not accounting for the languages of lesser diffusion that are spoken out in the U.S., which may not be even considered by some of these systems that collect these forms of data or information. As far as Texas is concerned, we have, which is not surprising, around 7 million people in Texas speak Spanish. No, 7 million, that's too many. I'm sorry, that's the entire count. But 29.5% out of 7 million people in the state of Texas speak Spanish. So, of course, Spanish is probably the most predominant other language spoken. Then we have Vietnamese, Chinese, Tagalog, and then so on and so forth. Again, just to give a sense of the languages spoken here in Texas, and again, this does not account for languages of lesser diffusion, because perhaps folks or systems that collect this data haven't even considered that those might be spoken in the state of Texas. Of course, this varies from city to city. Certainly in the more metropolitan areas, you have more diverse languages spoken. But I would definitely urge you all to go and look at the demographics of language spoken in your community so you can get a sense of that. Okay, so a couple of more questions. So folks can just put, so if someone's asking if you're going to get a copy of your slide, yes, you'll receive a copy of their PowerPoints and whatever else, other supporting materials I may have to provide to TAASA, yes. So very quickly, this is another moment of engagement. What is the relationship between language and identity? If folks can write that in the chat box, that would be great, just very quickly. So just very quickly, what is the relationship between language and identity? What are some thoughts from folks? If folks can put that in the chat box. Helps shape your identity. Okay, they go hand in hand. Question mark, don't they? Question mark. Language defines identity. Okay. Okay. So, common language bonds people, yes. It helps you find your place in community. Thank you for that. So the next question is, how does your language affect your identity? So how does language, whatever language you speak or other languages that you speak or diverse forms of communication that you use, how does that affect your identity? Language defines your background and identifies your group. Okay. What else? How does your language that you use affect your identity? Who you can connect with. Okay. Separates me from one of another culture or community. Definitely. Helps me help others. The way you think. Definitely. Okay. And then the last question, how does language define a community's identity and power? That's a big question. So how does language define a community's identity and power? Because ultimately, in the work that we do as advocates, particularly those of us who have the role of advocates, working with survivors of sexual assault, sexual violence, we use this term empowering survivors, which has some complexity around using that term, but we always use the word empowering survivors. So what does that mean? The more popular language is, the more resources there are, definitely. Allows people to communicate their values, wants, and needs, definitely. It's so important, as I mentioned before, being able to communicate issues around your safety and concerns. It could give a community more privilege, definitely. Depends the predominant language and how it ranks in the community. Yes, definitely. So thank you for that. Yes, so yes, to all of that. How you communicate and being able to express your concerns, and yes, how you access those resources based on what is the dominant language or lack of accessibility. And I think I really like this quote, and this is from How to Build Language Justice. It's a curriculum, and the link is there provided. And again, you will all receive a copy of the PowerPoint. Conversation and learning rarely happen unless people can communicate to and understand each other. And I think that is, again, as I mentioned before, this is one of the fundamental pieces of advocacy that we do. Conversation and learning rarely happens unless people can talk and or communicate to and understand each other. Because if I'm not able to understand what a survivor of sexual violence is trying to communicate, and even when the survivor speaks in English, there's some level of patience in trying to discern what the person or survivor or survivors are trying to explain to us, and that's when the person is speaking English. Now imagine a survivor who may be limited English proficient, who may use a diverse form of communication such as sign language, and having that, again, it's like that is so fundamental to the advocacy that we do, right? Because through listening and active listening, we get to know people's stories, we get to know people's histories of trauma. But if there's a challenge around that communication piece, what do we do and how do we do that? So really, relation between language and cultural identity. Language does not exist in isolation. Language is a part of culture, as some of you have already affirmed. Yes, it's not a form of isolation. Just speaking for myself, again, as I mentioned before, because I have the ability to speak in Spanish, I'm able to communicate with my family who doesn't speak English. I'm able to communicate in many different ways around fears and concerns, joys that I have with my parents, with my sister, with my brother, my nieces, my nephews, everybody. And definitely it was part of my upbringing, part of my cultural identity formation. Language and culture are at the core of all human society. And again, you can define language and culture in so many different ways, but it's the core of all human society. As some of you already mentioned in the chat box or shared, it's a way of finding your own identity within your own community, right? Being able to communicate, being able to share, being able to do so many things. Language is a symbolic system through which people communicate and transmit culture. It's also a way of how we, from generation to generation, we share our stories. For example, how many of you, if you are connected and close to your family or your family of choice, when you gather with your loved ones, how many times do you share about what happened during your work week, or you're excited that you're going to a party, or you haven't seen a friend for a long time? Imagine that you are actually communicating, you are transferring knowledge about your own self to the other. And again, when we bring it back to the aspect of language accessibility and being accessible to survivors who are maybe limited English proficient or use diverse forms of communication, that is what people are doing. They are transmitting their history. They are sharing their history. In this case, it could be their history of violence or survivorhood. That is so important, right? And we carry that with us, right? And we learn from those stories or those histories that are being shared by survivors. Certainly, 20 years later, every history that was shared by a survivor in my attempt to advocate with them is now part of my history, and now enables me to communicate with others around the essence and the fundamental appreciation of being culturally humble and being accessible in so many different ways. In this case, we're talking about language and diverse forms of communication. It is a transmission of story and history, and I'm able to share that with others of knowledge, right? Which brings us to this question around language, identity, and privilege. As I mentioned before, using myself as an example, again, I have the privilege, I am male, I have the privilege of that. I have the privilege of being able to be bilingual in Spanish, read it and write it to some extent. And all of these forms of things come together, and right? And again, putting the lens and the scrutiny on us as the gatekeepers to these services, how do these three things affect and impact my advocacy when I'm trying to be accessible for survivors of diverse communities? Sorry about that. So language, a community's identity and power. So having a sense of identity and language has purpose and meaning. When someone belongs from a minority language community within a minority culture, such as Spanish in the U.S., is often associated with the maintenance of a minority's values and with the continuation of its unique cultural identity. That is so basic and so important. There's been a lot of research. I read some research around telenovelas or soap operas in Spanish, and how that's a form of communication and maintaining connectivity specifically for Latinos who are in the U.S. Because a lot of times it's a thing as silly as a soap opera reflects a lot of the cultural values and norms of that person coming from whatever Latin American country that they come from, right? So again, it's a form of shared values and connectivity. Loss of a language can also be associated with a loss of a cultural identity. Languages can be lost for a variety of reasons. And sometimes that's done because of safety issues in order to assimilate to the predominant spoken language in the community or the culture. For example, I was watching this TED Talk being conducted by a university student who was studying languages or lost languages. And he said, and I'm just paraphrasing, but he stated that on the daily, there's about 50 or 100 languages being lost, going extinct in the world, across the world. That is so tragic because, again, if language is a form of maintaining community knowledge, and those languages are disappearing, where do those identities go to, right? As social conditions change, may be imposed and another suppressed by dominant power. Again, same thing happens with language. When we don't have the ability to be accessible for survivors in the language that they speak or their form of communicating, people become suppressed, people don't come to us, people don't access the crisis centers or access our services. Which brings me to this statement that we often, I hear say, and still to this date, Well, if they're survivors or people like that, I mean, our services are accessible to everyone. Are they really? Are they really, right? So that really answering that question is really having some critical analysis around that question. It's like, is our organization accessible to everyone? And what does that mean? Is it talking around language access, talking around people who use diverse forms of communication, people who maybe identify as part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, people who may be part of the Muslim community, people of diverse racial and ethnic identities? What does that look like? So again, this comment and current statement that happens like, we provide services to everyone, but what does that everyone mean, and what does that everyone look like in your community? Which brings us to this whole issue around language, violence, and identity. Certainly in current times, I have seen, and you may have seen this too in social media, of videos of people being attacked because they speak their own language or speak with an accent. And these are images that are being transmitted across our communities that are being seen by survivors who may be limited English proficient or use diverse forms of communication. That's a carryover. That could be a reason why survivors with limited English proficiency do not come forward. A very significant part of that conversation. And also, they may have attempted to access your services in the organization, but weren't able to communicate because you may have a website that says, we speak Spanish here, but it's not translated into Spanish. Or if you do have translation into Spanish, para español, oprima aquí o haga clic aquí, and it does translate into Spanish, for example, is the translation correct? Right? And so, again, how language, violence, and identity are all interconnected in the work that we do as advocates and in providing safety and advocacy and accessibility for survivors of sexual assault or sexual violence. This is all related. This is all connected. So what is language justice? So does anyone have an idea what language justice means? Can y'all put that in the chat box? Just take a wild guess for folks. Just taking the word language justice, what does that mean to you when you hear that term? There's no right or wrong answer, just like, what is language justice? So what do y'all think that is? Reforming systems to provide language accessible services, equality, yes. Being able to understand and accommodate for, removing language barriers to access, yes. Acceptance, yes. Empowering survivors by allowing them to express themselves in their native language, yes. So basically, the right everyone has to communicate in the language in which we feel most comfortable. Wow, that is significant. That is huge. And again, even when we share the same privilege of speaking the same language, there may be some different forms of expressing certain things that make people uncomfortable. But again, it is the right for everyone has to communicate in the language in which they feel most comfortable and or the form of diverse communications that they feel most comfortable with. Cultural responsiveness through language justice. It promotes autonomy and self-determination by making sure that everyone's voice is heard and that all of the transmitted information is relayed. Again, and to put it in the frame of our advocacy that we do, is quite often we often say that at the center of every policy, every change we're going to do that may impact survivors of sexual assault or sexual violence should be centered with the voice of survivor, right? The voices of survivors need to be at the table. That also means the voices of survivors who may not speak the same language that we do. So language justice creates linguistically democratic spaces where no one language is privileged so that people can meet as equals regardless of their primary language. Again, as some of you have already affirmed, having equitable spaces for folks to be able to communicate regardless of their primary language, which requires some work and detailing, which we'll be talking about around how to develop a language access plan, but it is possible. Teaches that interpretation is not in the service of the non-English speakers, but rather for everyone that does not share a common language. Again, if at the core, if one of our fundamental values as advocates is to be proactive listeners, which at the core of everything we do is around communication and trust and transparency, this is it. It teaches that interpretation is not in the service of the non-English speakers, but rather for everyone that does not share a common language. Because it's not about being convenient for me as the advocate, it's about what is accessible for the survivor. And part of social language justice is creating multilingual spaces, ungendering language, and decentering monolingual only practices or spoken language only practices. Because again, we have to consider survivors who may use diverse forms of communication, such as ASL. So creating multilingual spaces, how it works, it's a collective agreement by everyone in the group, the facilitators, and the organization to fully bring both languages of diverse forms of communication and cultures to the discussion table. Again, doing every reasonable attempt to do that. A shared analysis of the way language and culture can both empower and oppress, to include and exclude, as some of you already mentioned that, shared that. Co-facilitation with bilingual and bicultural facilitators who can lead the process in both languages or diverse forms of communication and can draw out and reflect the group's different cultural reference points. Again, as I mentioned before, in the example of Latino communities who speak Spanish, again, just because we speak Spanish, it doesn't mean when I use a certain verb, noun, or adjective, it's going to be using this under the same context for another person who comes like from Mexico or Peru or Puerto Rico or so on. Comprehensive written translation that meets reasonable standards of meaningful access in both languages. Again, it has to be comprehensive. And this also includes Braille, in case you may have someone who uses that form of communication. And again, meets reasonable standards of meaningful access in both languages. And the keyword is meaningful access, which is something we'll be discussing in the second part or the second webinar. What is meaningful access as far as language accessibility? Ungendering language, how it works. Think about, prepare for, and begin including non-sexist, gender-inclusive language. So in the case of lesbian, gay, bi, and trans or queer people are defining themselves in ways that are true. That means reclaiming or changing language in the process because the options that exist within the current language don't always have the space for various gender identities and gender expressions. Again, not assuming who calls to the crisis hotline, to the organization or the crisis center that we assume gender identity, which can also be a very challenging paradigm shift for a lot of us. But there's also training around that and how to be an ally around that. But again, around language justice, this is about preparing for and beginning including non-sexist, gender-inclusive language. Decentering monolingual only practices or spoken language only practices. Language justice work is long-term work. Keep bringing it up wherever you are. So this brings me to a point around if you happen to be the bilingual advocate in your organization, it is not just the sole responsibility of the bilingual advocate to create an organization that is accessible for limited English proficient survivors. It is the entire organization. And for those of us who may identify as allies to the bilingual, bicultural, and maybe biliterate advocate in your organization, is to how do we own that and how do we create an organization that is accessible? Because I've heard stories of where you have a bilingual advocate that has never taken a vacation in 10 years. True story. And stories around how the bilingual advocate is always on call how the bilingual advocate, regardless of where they're at in the community, they may be doing a presentation. They always have to be on call and responsive because the person at the front desk can't respond to the survivor. That's a problem because we know that we deal with situations that are life and death situations. We know that. If you are bilingual and interested in learning more about it, interpretation, make an effort to increase your knowledge and skill. Again, just because I have the privilege of being bilingual Spanish does not mean that I know everything. Which brings me back to this point again. If you have a bilingual advocate in your organization, they are not a certified interpreter. They are not a certified translator. Those require different levels of skills. And if you're going to hire a bilingual advocate to translate your materials, are you compensating fairly for that? Again, this is something we'll be talking about on how to develop a language access plan. But again, if we're going to be decentering monolingual only practices, again, it is the responsibility of the organization. And again, if you're already doing interpretation and want to think more about language justice, commit to learning more about what it takes to create multilingual spaces. And what does that look like, right? And again, we'll go into more depth around in the second webinar on how to develop a language access. Again, part of this, more questions as we go into this dialogue is like understanding who are you in this conversation? Who are you, whether you're an advocate or community educator or whatever role you have at the center, is like who are you, right? And this specifically goes to who you're also hiring to be part of the organization. Who are they? Do they prescribe to the mission of the organization when you say we provide services to everybody? And do you break it down for that person? Who is this person? This is in reference to who is the person, who are the people in your community that you're trying to engage. In this case, limited English proficient survivors. Who are they? Where do they come from? What kind of food do they eat? Where do they practice their faith? So on, right? How do you see the person as they see you, right? So again, as I mentioned before, this whole issue around we go into trainings where they teach us how survivors or communities are supposed to access us, but very, very rarely do we ask the question, well, how does community see the organization, right? If we are going to have a practice and philosophy around community engagement principles, that means that putting ourselves in the hands of community and letting community tell us where we're failing and we're being successful as well. What is the context of your work and the principles that guide it? Again, around language access, language justice, and so on. What is the principles that guide your work? Because having good intentions is not good enough. For those of us who've been doing this work around systems change and individual advocacy and systems advocacy, good intention is not good enough. Having a bilingual advocate is not good enough. It is an organizational change around accessibility for survivors of sexual assault. How do all these come together? Again, how does it all come together? From beginning with the organization, trickling down to whoever is part of the organization. And that includes board, upper management, middle management, frontline people, and even the folks that your volunteers and the folks that do the maintenance of your organization. They all have to be part of this accessibility plan, be part of this decentering of English only or monolingual spoken languages only, being part of that conversation. And also, again, part around language access is not just looking at the organization or our organizations or the organization we represent, but also when we're doing the referral, do these other organizations, are they language accessible? And 9 times out of 10, they say they are, but maybe they're not. So as an organization, their official statement, yes, we have language access, but that doesn't mean the individual person who's at the front desk who's going to receive the person you're advocating with has that analysis, right? So looking and putting perspective of this and looking at how the survivor or diverse communities of survivors of sexual violence, gender-based violence, sexual assault, have to engage with all these diverse organizations and systems, but it's also the individual representative of each of these systems who, as we talked about earlier, how does culture impact the work that I do, may have certain fundamental beliefs and practices that may not allow them to see the person beyond them not speaking English, or maybe having limited English proficiency, or speaking with an accent, or using diverse forms of communication. So I am going to stop here. We have like 5 minutes for question and answer, or Q&A. Wendy, is there anything else? But I'll stop here for now.
Nope. Everybody's been paying attention and writing awesome responses. I haven't seen any questions so far. So if you have them, now's the time to chat them in. Except that you are awesome one.
Thank you. And just again, as a quick reminder, we do provide, as I mentioned before, language access is one of the areas of training and technical assistance we provide. So if folks would want more training in TA around this issue or other forms, I will also share our training in TA menu of topical areas. Wendy, you can share with the participants so that way they know what other areas of training and technical assistance we provide as well.
I believe it's all in the information you sent that we'll be putting out, that will go out in an hour in the email.
Perfect. Thank you. And I do want to reiterate that this is an ongoing process. I don't want to sound off like I'm pointing fingers and you need to be perfect. Definitely not. This is just the beginning of the dialogue. It's just to put a framework around the conversation, and really, again, as gatekeepers to the organizations and being advocating with survivors is so important. So again, I'm not perfect. TAASA Esperanza is by no means perfect either. This is language access is an ongoing dynamic for us as well as an organization, and often learning from other folks and other community members. So again, it is a challenge, and we acknowledge that.
Okay, I see some questions, and it's got to do with more tech stuff. And yes, this webinar has been recorded, and it will be on the TAASA YouTube channel in about 10 business days.
Well, if there are no questions for me, Wendy, again, thank you, Wendy and TAASA, for inviting us to be part of this dialogue with you all and the member programs that are part of TAASA. As I mentioned before, it's always a great honor and pleasure to work with you all. Wendy, thank you again for your support in this process. I know you're an amazing advocate, and thank you so very much.
Thank you, JJ, for all that you do. I would back at you. I think you're an amazing advocate as well. So, you know, thanks to everyone for being here, for paying attention. And please, if you have any ideas, any questions, anything, don't fail to hesitate to contact TAASA or Jose Juan or me, and we will keep this going, and we'll see y'all next week, hopefully for part 2. Thank y'all, and thanks, JJ.
Thank you.
Bye.